Hello, Education 2301. Here is your week 3 explanation. We're going to be moving on to 3 more categories of exceptionality. And so we've got a discussion and an activity that we're going to be going over as well. So there's the OER lecture materials, there's a discussion and a task analysis. And this is one strategy that you can use with intellectual and developmental disabilities, autism, ADHD, and so we'll see how that works. Now, when I started 20 years ago, intellectual and developmental disabilities was just the category of mental retardation. And so how we talk about this exceptionality has changed. And I think that it's more honoring than what it was before. And so for younger children, usually under the age of 5, we talk about developmental disabilities, and older children, we talk about intellectual disabilities, because once again, children develop at their own timetable. And so is something just an area where someone is going at a slower pace, or is it something that needs more support? And so this helps figure that out by giving them the time. Here is the lecture that I did over IDD. And what is it? How do you know someone has an intellectual disability? Here's another perspective on it. This right here is the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And once again, it talks about how do you know someone has an intellectual disability, and it talks about intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. When is the onset of symptoms that you notice? How long have you had them? Here is a video over what causes an intellectual disability. Some of them are really easy to know. Some of them are not. Next is going to be material over autism. And so this is the lecture that I did over autism spectrum disorders. This one is a video. This one came out in the 80s. It's with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman, Rain Man. And so sometimes when someone hears the word autism, a picture comes in your head of what that looks like. And so this gives you a look in the 80s of what people tended to think of when we talk about autism. But once again, it's a spectrum disorder. And so there are characteristics, and in each part of them, children can have them to a certain degree, whether they're sensory issues or language, communication. This is a link to visual schedules, which is a strategy to help. Here's some resources. This is a reading over Blue Day. This man has Asperger's, and so he explains the mind and the thinking. Here's Temple Grandin. She is another person with autism, and she shares her story. This looks at the emotional side of it, and so realize that when you have parents coming to you, they are in some stage of grief. Sometimes they're in depression, sometimes they're in denial, sometimes they're in acceptance. And so this can shift. And so this gives you an idea of some of their emotions that they go through. And then, of course, there's Temple Grandin again. ABA is a therapy technique that you can use with autism, and it's very structured. And so here's an example of it. This is for assessment of autism, and this is a behavior scale that you can look at. And so these would be some signs that maybe a friend in your classroom would need to be referred for autism. Next is going to be lower incidence. And so this is where I spent my time in public education. And so here's auditory impairment. I know a lot about it. I try to keep it contained. But this is good over providing services and accommodations. This is looking at interpreters, about providing notes ahead of time, placement in the classroom. Here's a lecture that I did over it. How a cochlear implant works, types of hearing loss, if you want to see what different types of hearing loss is. Visual impairment is the next one. Dr. Harvey is an orientation and mobility specialist, and so she works with children who have visual impairments. So this is a simulation of what different types of visual impairments look like. A lot of times people think that means no sight at all. That's not what a visual impairment means. And so I go into that in the lecture material. Here's traumatic brain injury and lower incidence ones. Dr. Harvey's son, Tate, suffered a traumatic brain injury from a ATV accident. And so I walk you through that. Believe it or not, it was 3 years ago. And he's back at school doing great. And so this explains more about traumatic brain injury. Now to the content material or your assignments for today, this week. So what has stood out to you most about special education and exceptionalities? And you can talk about ones that are going to be next week as well. What questions do you have? What has you excited? What has you concerned? Because when you are a general education teacher, you are signing up for special education because of inclusion. Children who have diagnoses will be in your classroom. You may be alone and provide accommodations. You may have a co-teacher, you may have an assistant, but everyone's going to be working with children with special needs. So what concerns do you have? What are some takeaways that you can have? And you can talk about overall, or you can talk about, I'm really worried to have a friend with autism in my classroom because, and please feel free to share. And the next is going to be the week 3 activity. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. This is an example of a task analysis. She walks you through it really well. And this is where you take a task that a child doesn't seem to be able to do and break it down into its steps to find out, do they have the underlying skills to do it? And so what you're going to be doing is here's an example. Example of a task analysis where you look at all the steps. Is the student able to do them? Why can't they do it? And then are you going to teach a skill that they need to know, or are you going to adapt it? So what you're going to do is you're going to pick the activity of going through the lunch line. You're going to start them in the classroom. They're going to line up, and this is the child sitting down eating. Now, it doesn't have to be 10 steps. It could be 12 steps. It could be 7 steps. But then you're going to let me know. And you can pick any exceptionality. This could be a friend who has ADHD, who has poor impulse control. You can talk about a friend who has a visual impairment, like how are they going to get down the hall? How are they going to get a tray? How are they going to sit down? It could be somebody who has an intellectual disability, somebody, say, has Down syndrome. So you can pick any exceptionality and see if you can walk them through. And then if these all can't be mastered, but they all don't have to be, they don't have it mastered it either. Why can't they do it? And then what can you do? Can you teach them? So for example, if they have to punch in a code, is that something you can teach them to memorize? Is that something where they're going to have a card that they're going to look at? Is that something that they're now going to have something that gets scanned? Something along those lines where you would teach a skill or adapt it. So that's week 3, and I look forward to seeing you guys on the discussion board this week.